Hey everyone, so this is just a quick tutorial on conducting research on Maine legislation, basically running through the handout that I passed in class, and I'll actually be hopping out of here and running through some of this on the bill tracking and text search website in the Maine legislature to show you how to get in there and how to understand some of the information that's there. There's a tremendous amount of information on the Maine State Legislature's website, but it can be kind of tricky to navigate, especially if you've never done this before. And there's some terminology and just some tricks to using that website and getting the most out of it that I think will be helpful for you. So again, like I said with the Path of Legislation video, we'll be talking about this in class. We'll be running through it together, but I wanted to have something that you could refer back to throughout the course, and wanted to kind of record this for you so you have a reference point. So the first thing I'd note in this handout, you have 3 different links here. There's also direct links to these on the Blackboard site, so feel free to go there into the Legislative Advocacy Assignment folder, the resources that are available there, and you can click through directly to them. The first is the bill tracking and text search, which is, I think, the best way to navigate the materials that they have in the Maine legislature website. There's a couple different ways to access the bills themselves, but this one I think is the best search feature. You also have something that's just a bill status search. So this one, if you just have an LD number or a piece of legislation that you're working on, you can enter the LD number and it will tell you at that moment where it is in the process. If it's in committee, if it's been referred to another committee, if it's been tabled, if it came out of committee with a unanimous ought not to pass recommendation, if it's where it is in the floor voting process, if it's been sent out to the floor as a whole and who's voted on it. So that I think is helpful once you have a piece of legislation, if you want to find out where it is quickly. And then the last one is just a glossary of terms. So frequently in the process of researching legislation, you'll come across terms that are kind of legalistic, and everybody under the dome understands what they mean, but you might not understand what they mean. And so this will just clarify some of that and might be helpful to you. So that, again, that's a link through the Blackboard site, and I encourage you to use those links as you work on the process. All right, so now I'm going to run through some things to keep in mind when you search, and I'm actually going to hop out of here. I will jump into the Maine Legislature's website, which I thought I had open. I guess I don't. Oh, here we go. That's what we want. So here you go. A couple things to note right at the outset: that you have the ability in the this legislative bill tracking and text search website to choose which session you want to focus on. And for your active pieces of legislation, you want to choose the 128th legislature, that's the current legislature, and then the second regular session, which is the short session that we're in now. Okay. And then there's a number of different things that you can do here to limit your search field. So a bond issue, if you checked this, that would only come up as pieces of legislation that are seeking to authorize a bond that would then have to go before the voters, right? So a bond issue, anytime the state borrows money to finance, a public works project or investment in some area, they have to put that forward to the voters as a bond. Emergency legislation would be legislation, it changes the status of the legislation where it can enter into effect immediately as opposed to the typical 90-day wait period. Governor's bill would be a bill that was introduced by request of the governor or one of the state agencies that the executive branch oversees. And then mandate actually refers to a bill that mandates changes in expenditure at the municipal level. And there's some stuff, some state law that requires the Maine state legislature to authorize funding for at least 90% of any of those funding changes. If it introduces expenses for local governments, they have to fund at least 90% of that. So these are just different types of legislation. And if you were interested in a specific one, you could specify that. You can also specify LD number. Paper number is what they use to classify a piece of legislation before it has an LD number. Fiscal impact here, you can specify by fiscal impact. But I think the most useful thing is usually the text search. So I'll type in an issue that I research a lot, and which I know some of you are interested in and might even be working on, which is immigration here. And you just get a sense of what is being considered this legislative session. All right, so when you do a search, it's going to come up with results. You have an LD number for all of these. It means that they have been introduced as pieces of legislation. They're active in the current session. So you have the LD number there. You have the bill title. You're going to see some other things here. So this specific piece of legislation is an act to facilitate compliance with federal immigration law by state and local government entities. And if you do LD Quick View, you're going to get some information about the bill here. Let me actually hop out of here and go to bill and fiscal information. Okay, so fiscal status not yet determined. That means that the Office of Fiscal and Program Review has not yet had time to review this. And we see here that this is a governor's bill, right? So this is a bill that was introduced at the request of Governor LePage this session. And then if you click on the printed document, you have the actual text of the bill itself. And we see also that this is relatively recent, right? This is February 8th. So this was just introduced recently. And we also have some information about the sponsors, right? So this says presented by Representative Lockman of Amherst. That's Larry Lockman, Republican in the House. And governor's bill means he's presenting it on behalf of the governor. But you have a number of co-sponsors here. Mason, Dillingham, Timberlake, Ward, Brakey, right? These are all Republicans. And we see also that this has been referred to the Judiciary Committee. So the bill has been sent on to committee. It's somewhere in the calendar of the committee they're going to be working on this bill. From here, usually what I like to do, once I've figured out the LD number, when it was introduced, what the title is, where it's been referred to, who the sponsors and co-sponsors are, is I scroll to the very end of the document, which seems kind of counterintuitive. But at the very end, you have the bill summary. And so this, in the simplest, most straightforward way possible, usually in a paragraph or two paragraphs, or sometimes even just a single sentence, will summarize what the bill proposes to do. Right? And so this says, the bill establishes prohibitions concerning restricting the sharing and use of immigration and citizenship information. It prohibits restricting the enforcement of federal immigration law. It establishes a complaint process and a duty to report. There's a penalty for this practice, and it introduces a fine, lays out what the government entities are that would enforce this. So I happen to know a little bit about this issue and this area of immigration policy, and I can say what this relates to is something called retainers, the practice of using retainers, where the federal government will issue a request to a local police department to hold someone in custody past their release date so that the immigration and customs enforcement officials can intercept them, potentially to investigate immigration violations. They're in the country illegally, they've overstayed a visa. This doesn't just relate to police departments, though. This can also potentially, I'd have to look at the text of the bill, but it could be things like local school systems providing information when requested about a student whose family might be undocumented. Those sorts of levels of cooperation, which in the past year, just in the past few months actually, we've had a series of high-profile incidents in which various sheriffs of different counties in Maine have said publicly that they will not comply with these retainer requests from the federal government, and Paul LePage suggesting that as governor he would have them removed from their office as sheriff. So this is the governor's attempt to address this through law. And if you scroll up here, you have the specifics of the bill itself, the title, definitions of certain key terms. Here we go, immigration detainer. I was saying retainer, but this is essentially what I was talking about. And it looks like this is not dealing with, the school systems issue or other local entities. It looks like it's strictly dealing with law enforcement and whether or not law enforcement will cooperate with federal authorities. So local law enforcement cooperating with federal authorities. And then you would kind of read through these different provisions and you would learn more about the piece of legislation. But in terms of choosing a piece of legislation and trying to figure out in the most general sense what it does, usually that summary is very helpful. We see that there could be, it may require a fiscal note. It said it has not yet been reviewed by the Office of Fiscal and Program Review, but this is potentially going to generate revenue with this $500 fine. And so we could see at a later stage in the process, there would be some sort of attachment to this that would lay out whether this, what the cost of enforcement would be, and if they collect these $500 fines and this generates revenue for the state, how they'd be dealt with. So that's the type of information that is available. Now, this is a relatively new piece of legislation, so normally there'd be a lot of other things here as well. You might have committee information, amendments, testimony that had been provided. But this bill was only introduced a few days ago, and so it's not going to have that information yet. So that's one example of a piece of legislation that you would find using the legislature's website. And I'm going to go to a different example. LD 1492 is result number 2 here. Here we have, as before, this looks kind of like the last piece of legislation we looked at. We know that this was referred to the Committee on State and Local Governments from the Secretary of the Senate, so it originated in the Senate. And we see here, this was actually introduced April 19th, 2017 by Representative Cates in the Senate. And then you have Senator Cates in the Senate, and then Representative Stewart of Presque Isle, actually a former UMaine political science student, Langley, Joyce Maker, Mastraccio. So you have the co-sponsors here. And this bill has quite a bit more substance to it. So we scroll down, we have some information here. Again, I'll scroll right to the end and go to the bill summary. Okay, it's a more involved summary, right? It has quite a bit more going on. So we see that this bill is, at its core, it's trying to attract, educate, and retain workforce immigrant populations. And it lays out the ways in which it does that. The creation of an Office of New Mainers, a Welcome Center initiative that would provide adult education, help integrate foreign trained workers into their local workforce, and then establishes some grant programs to support this, to contract to provide English language instruction, to assist counties, municipalities, school administrative units in integrating these new immigrant populations, and adult education programs as well, and expanding the Welcome Center initiative of Lewiston to attract and educate and retain employment for foreign trained workers in Androscoggin County. So expanding an already existing initiative, modeling it on the New Mainers Welcome Center that exists in Portland. So there we have the summary. You notice what's different here is that there is some fiscal information attached, right? Appropriations and Allocations. So this would be allocating some money. It's broken down by the different subsections. So just the adult education portion in 2017, 2018, 2018, 2019 would be $75,000 each year. And they go through the different sections and lay out what the cost would be, with a net cost of $745,000 in the first year, and then $825,000 in the second year. So that would have been the Office of Fiscal and Program Review providing that information. Now, what you've probably noticed here is that this is making reference to 2017, that this bill was introduced in April of 2017, which was actually last session. It was the first session of the 128th legislature. And so when we look at this bill, if we go to the bill and fiscal information, go to quick view. Yeah, so that was kind of a circuitous way of getting us over to bill tracking. But you see that the last House action on this was in August. And this was carried over, meaning that even though it fizzled out last session, there wasn't a vote on it, and it wasn't voted for or against by the legislature, we see that it's been carried over to the next session, right? So this is the second regular session, and so this has been carried over. So this is something that was considered in the last legislative session and now is going to be considered once again. The other thing that I would note here is committee testimony, right? So in addition to the bill itself, the bill summary, you also have a couple of amendments here. You also have testimony, 20 different testimonies from the public hearing on the bill, which actually happened in May of last year. And you can see who's testifying here. Business, someone involved with Advanced Pierre Foods, a business. You have Portland Public School, the City Council in Lewiston, Coastal Enterprises, Inc., Concerned Resident, John Doerr, a number of different groups here, right? And if you click on any one of these pieces of testimony, why don't we click on Beth Stickney's testimony? So Beth runs an organization called the Maine Business Immigration Coalition. If we click on this, we actually see her testimony, right? And so there you go. It's 2 pages, and she's talking about the experiences of individuals, how she has experience as an immigration lawyer, and how this piece of legislation would fill job openings that currently employers are struggling to fill. And same with these other pieces of testimony, right? You have Roger Cates, the sponsor of the bill, and there we have his testimony to the committee, right? Which is significantly more extensive, but essentially he's justifying his own bill. So this can be really helpful in a couple different respects. First, it's usually clearer to read than the legislation itself. The legislation itself, it can be kind of difficult to wade through what it's exactly proposing to do, but you should read it closely. But this is often written in more of a narrative, kind of comprehensible form. It also gives you a sense of what the different interests are on a specific pieces of legislation, and what coalition might be supporting the proposal, what sort of coalition might be against the proposal, right? So here we have the business sector, we have public schools, we have adults and community education, we have state and local governments within the state, specifically Lewiston City Council, that's a council person there, Maine Healthcare Association, so professional organizations represented here. So it gives you a sense of who are the different groups that would support this or be against it. We also have reference here to a work session, right? So this bill did actually go through a work session, and ultimately, I believe there were some amendments added. Right? If we go back to the the bill itself has a couple different amendments which are added, potentially as floor amendments, but I don't think it actually made it out of committee, so those might have actually been committee amendments. So that's going to give you information as well. What would the bill end up looking like with those amendments? So there's a lot of information there. Say if you were working on LD 1492, a good place to start beyond just the bill itself and the fiscal note attached would be to read that committee testimony. And then if you want to go further, maybe even reach out to some of those people and try to talk to them about the bill and why they think it's important. So there's a lot of information embedded in this website. And it's a great starting point for a piece of legislation. Now, I'll just jump really quickly, I think, on the other, this bill. You saw me try to navigate through to where the bill actually is, and that can be tricky. I think the best way to do this is simply this page, which there's a link directly on the course Blackboard site, and that's the link that was referenced on our handout too. But here you go. If you just do the LD number and a search, that's probably the quickest way to just figure out where a piece of legislation is. So here we see the committee that's referenced. The committee that was referenced to is Education and Cultural Affairs, last House action August 2nd, 2017, and then this was carried over. And this will fill out, right? This, as various steps occur as we move forward with the piece of legislation, you'll see other things. It might be referred to other committees. There might be a report out that emerges from a committee, or it might eventually go for floor vote and potential floor amendments, first and second reading, might even be presented to the governor for his signature, but that will all be tracked in this bill status site. So I encourage you to use that as well. So I think that was all I wanted to run through here. All of those different elements that we were talking about, the sponsors and co-sponsors, the committee, bill summary, fiscal information, committee testimony, amendments, bill status, all of that I lay out on your handout as well. So a starting point really, if you're thinking about a piece of legislation, is to dig in on the bill tracking site and try to get as much information as you can, and particularly if you have something that was considered in a previous legislative session. There's usually plenty of information there. It's just a matter of knowing how to get there. So like I said, we'll be running through this in class, and you'll have an opportunity to ask questions and kind of raise any concerns or points of confusion that you have. And also, I would just say, if you're struggling with this at any point, if you're just kind of wading through information and really struggling to figure out what a piece of legislation would do, trying to interpret pieces of legislation, never hesitate to reach out to me, and we can set up a time to chat, talk after class. You can come by office hours. So I'll wrap up there, and I look forward to running through this in class as well.